The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing, and addresses the assessment standards that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning in poetry. Learners should be able to recognize that verse and stanza forms, rhyme, rhythm, and punctuation affect meaning. In this series, we are discussing poetry. The thing to remember about poetry is that even though we're studying it in its written format, it is an art form that exists in many forms and dimensions. So far, we've looked at the words, the sounds, the rhythms, the images, and the rhymes created by the poem on and off the page. And today, we're going to take this one step further and look at poetry as a mode of word art. The meaning of poem is created by a number of factors, and one of them is how the poem looks on the page. This is not a technique that is used often, but it is worth looking at and thinking about because occasionally you will come across a poem which has an interesting shape. When this rather rare type of poem comes along, the poet uses our ability to see shapes and patterns to add another layer of meaning to the word. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to discuss how the shape of a poem contributes to the overall meaning. I'd like you to take a look at this poem. Don't worry that you can't read the words. We've done that on purpose. Instead, look at the outline of the poem. What does it make you think of? What about if I gave you a clue and asked the technicians to turn the poem on its side? What about now? Still confused? What if I told you the title of this poem is Easter Wings, and that the poet was a very religious Christian? In fact, he was a poet and a priest who lived a long time ago. I'm pretty sure that most of you are starting to have an idea what the poet was thinking of. But just in case, here is one last hint. For this poem's shape to make sense, it is necessary to think about the story Easter. Christians believe that after Jesus was crucified and died, he rose again, and that two angels that were seen guarding the tomb on Easter Sunday. We can see that two stanzas side by side look like two angels flying upwards, and we are looking at them from behind. Here we literally see the Easter wings in the title. For a very long time indeed, poets have enjoyed playing with the shape of poems and seeing how they could use the shape of a poem to add to the meaning. Herbert took the idea of this poem, Easter Wings, from a Greek poem based on the shape of the wings of Cupid, the god of love. So you can see that playing with shape has been considered both fun and meaningful for a long time. But remember, having a fun shape is not enough. The shape of the poem must contribute to the meaning of the poem. The shape must always add something more that the poem would not have if it were just printed normally on the page. Let's look at a modern South African example of a shape poem called On the Step that was written by Esa Patel about a tragedy involving brutality and violence in the prisons during the apartheid years.
In the midnight hour, I had a sad song. In the heat of the night, I had a dry groan. In the blistering dawn, I had a skull crack. On the prison steps, I saw a broken guitar and my brother's blood.
At first glance, this poem isn't that different from the layout of a normal poem, but here I'm going to give you a clue again.
In the midnight hour, I had a sad song. In the heat of the night, I had a dry groan. In the blistering dawn, I had a skull crack.
Add the fact that the title is called On the Steps, and can you see why the poet made the decision he did about the shape of the words, which although they aren't exactly like steps, definitely communicate the ideas of a flight of stairs, like this. Well, I've got one more South African example that I'd like us to look at. In this case, we're just looking at a small section of a poem by Donald Perenzi called Feeding. Once again, see if you can spot the visual message the poet is giving us in the section of the poem where he is talking about fishing.
Fixing bait, flexing and casting out their messages in gut and sun. Especially, they sing, and what I catch, I know is fact.
Can you see how the poet places his words to indicate a fishing line being cast out into the water and then the hook sinking and lying straight down in the water? Like that. Now that you know how shape can help a poem to create meaning, let's take a look at a shape poem and analyze how the ideas and words are given an extra dose of meaning by being arranged in a shape.
Constantly risking absurdity and death, whenever he performs above the heads of his audience, the poet, like an acrobat, climbs on rhyme, to a high wire of his own making, and balancing on I-beams above a sea of faces, paces his way to the other side of day, performing entrechats and sleight-of-foot tricks.
Let's focus closely on the first part of the poem to see what the speaker is describing. The poem is shaped like the ladder the wire walker climbs to get onto the high wire. The lines of the poem are like the rungs on the ladder, and the visual arrangement of the poem is part of the wire walking metaphor. The line, the poet like an acrobat, is a simile. In other words, the poem is comparing being a poet to being as dangerous as being a tightrope walker. Just like the tightrope walker has to place every single step very carefully, a poet has to choose and place every word very carefully. In this series of lessons, we've been looking at the techniques of poetry, and 3 of them are illustrated in the first section of this poem. Let's look closely at the opening lines of the poem. As we have said, the lines of the poem are like the rungs of the ladder. The rungs illustrate the poet's techniques. Look at the simile here in line 6, like an acrobat. Look at the rhyme in line 7, climbs on rhyme. And the rhyme here in lines 11 and 12, way and day. Finally, look at lines 8 to 12, where the poet is described as an acrobat again, but using a metaphor this time. Sometimes the poem can be written in a way that is even more obvious in its shape. It is almost made concrete, which is actually another name for shape poems. What makes this so clever is that the writer forces us to think again about the frame through which we see everything, like this. The adult has no feet and the children are merely heads. The final 2 lines are philosophical in that they deal with ideas. We start to think carefully about what is complete and what is not, and the fact that certain things in our lives are never complete, the window, becomes a means to make us reconsider our lives. Before we read our next poem, look at this sea creature. This poem does not make us think about our lives the way the previous one did, but it does try to present the jellyfish in a new and different way, so that we look at the jellyfish more closely and with greater attention. We focus on the boneless body, its tentacles, and their movements and the dangerous nature of the jellyfish. If you are writing a shape poem, try not to write the words in a way that makes them difficult to read, like upside down. Look at this poem. Music entertains and inspires the living need to exert energy and to communicate dizzily through sound waves of foamy air. The imagery is unusual and the poem has potential, but by writing it in this way, with the words all over the place, the writer almost makes the reader not want to bother. To see if you've got what it takes to create a shape poem that people do want to read, it's time for today's task. Think about a topic that lends itself to being presented in a shape form. Write a shape poem using a suitable form. Remember that the shape must add to the meaning of the poem and that the poem must be easy to read. Using a shape to write a poem is unusual and so draws the reader's attention. The shape will add to the meaning of the poem by making the reader think of other aspects of the poem besides the words used. In the next lesson, you'll examine how meaning is affected by word choice. Until then, from me, Nkele Mutsumi, goodbye.